Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing our series on U.S. involvement in World War II. I'm going to talk about how World War II became the world's one and only atomic war. Alright, during World War II, all the different countries involved in the war dreamed about some sort of super weapon. A single weapon that would be so powerful that would end the war once and for all. Japan, the main two countries that dreamed of this, and particularly though, were Germany and the United States. Hitler was constantly enthralled with the idea of a super weapon that would be so powerful that it would overwhelm his enemies. And Germany put lots of money and resources into various weapons that Hitler hoped would be the super weapon. So the Germans spent money to develop massive cannons that were the biggest guns that had ever been created, that could fire shells that weighed tons and tons and tons over miles and miles. The Germans developed rockets, the V1 and V2 rocket programs that were the world's first ever missiles, which they rained down on London. Talk about terrifying, right? However, ironically, the one weapon that actually turned out to be a real war-ending super weapon Germany could have had, but it slipped through their fingers because of their hatred for the Jews. In the early and late 1930s, leading up to World War II, there was very promising research being done on the nature of atomic science, but most of those researchers were European. They lived in Germany and other countries that Germany would end up conquering. But most of them, including a physicist named Albert Einstein, were Jewish. In the 1930s, leading up to World War II, as there's increasing oppression of the Jews in Nazi Germany, many of those leading atomic scientists fled Nazi Germany and they immigrated to the United States. The United States was welcomed them with open arms. Why wouldn't we welcome the world's leading atomic scientists? Germany could have had atomic weapons if they hadn't driven all the Jews out. Well, funny how that works. So when the United States entered World War II, shortly after the United States entered World War II, a lot of these leading nuclear scientists who had immigrated to the United States, led by Albert Einstein, they wrote a letter to President Roosevelt and they said, we think that there is the potential to create a super weapon of unimaginable power, unlocking the inherent destructive power that is locked away in subatomic particles. And we want to fight for our adopted country, and we will be willing to try. We don't know if it's possible, but we're willing to try to develop a super weapon. Roosevelt says, ooh, I like the sound of this. Keep talking. And so Roosevelt greenlights the project, and the Manhattan Project is born. The Manhattan Project was the effort to develop a war-ending super weapon for the United States, an atomic weapon. It took pretty much the entire length of the United States' involvement in the war, from early 1942 until mid-1945. 42, 43, 44, 45. So for 3.5 years, they worked on this. The Manhattan Project was the most expensive weapon that had ever been developed in the history of warfare, either at the time or probably since, if you adjust for inflation. At the time, in 1945 dollars, the Manhattan Project cost $2 billion, which was the most that the government had ever spent on anything by a wide margin. It was done in absolute secrecy. The project was split up into different facilities around the country. Different facilities worked on different parts so that nobody would know the whole picture. In the spring of 1945, President Roosevelt died. He was succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman. The Manhattan Project was so secret that Harry Truman, the vice president of the United States, didn't even know about it until after he was sworn in as president, and his advisor said, oh, by the way, we're building an atomic super weapon. And Truman's like, oh, cool. So in the summer of 1945, the United States has taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa and is gearing up for a final assault on Japan. And Truman's advisors come to him and say, guess what? The Manhattan Project is finished. we have built an atomic superweapon. We have 3 of them. We have no idea whether they work or not. And Truman says, well, we got to test one. Let's test one and see what happens. They built 3 bombs because they only had enough fuel for 3 bombs. The fuel is the hard part to make. They built 3 bombs. The first of these was called Trinity. The Trinity bomb was exploded in the middle of the desert in Alamogordo, New Mexico in the summer of 1945. And when it went off with a bang, it was successful. It was the biggest explosion that had ever occurred in the United States before or up to that time. And the scientists all look at each other and say, oh wow, what have we done? Because it's bigger and more powerful even than they dared to hope. So they still have 2 bombs left. Now Truman has a choice. He can just threaten to use them, but not actually. He could drop them on some lightly inhabited or uninhabited area as a way of trying to scare the Japanese, or he can actually use them for real in Japanese cities. Truman demands that the Japanese surrender. Japanese refuse. So, in August 1945, the second bomb, called Little Boy, was loaded onto a heavy bomber, took off from the airfield on the island of Tinian, flew to Japan, and was dropped on a relatively unscathed city of Hiroshima. They wanted to drop it on a city that was unscathed so that they could see, up to that point, so that they could see the devastating impact. The single bomb took out pretty much the whole city of Hiroshima. The city was destroyed. At ground zero, there was nothing left. Most of the people died either in the blast or later from the effects of the radiation. The Japanese government still refused to surrender. Unknowns to the Allies, there were 2 factions within the Japanese government. One faction wanted to surrender, another faction wanted to keep fighting. 3 days later, the 3rd bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Now, Hiroshima was flat. It was completely wiped out. Nagasaki is not flat. Part of the city was protected from the force of the blast by a hill, but a good chunk of the city was destroyed. At this point, Emperor Hirohito himself got involved. He came out of his divine isolation in the palace and said, enough is enough, we must surrender. Now, the faction within the Japanese government that didn't want to surrender tried to stage a coup. So Emperor Hirohito recorded a speech that was going to be broadcast on the radio to the Japanese people announcing that Japan would surrender. This was be the first time that the Japanese had ever heard the voice of the emperor. The faction in the government that didn't want to surrender tried to steal the recording before it could be broadcast, but they were discovered and thwarted. The recording of the speech was broadcast to the Japanese people. The Japanese people heard their emperor for the first time telling them that the war was over and that they were surrendering. Now, some historians have said that Japan surrendered not because of the atomic bombs, but because the Russians had declared war on Japan finally and were invading and were moving in on Japan. I don't know. I don't really buy that. I have to see more evidence. In any case, Japan surrenders unconditionally except for that Hirohito still gets to be emperor. But otherwise, they surrender unconditionally. Now, there's a raging debate ever since as to whether or not the United States should have used these bombs. Some people say the United States, by using atomic, is the only country in the world to have ever used atomic weapons in warfare, and that what kind of people does that make us? Of course, as many people died in conventional bombings as in the atomic bombs. We had already bombed the stuffing out of cities in Germany and Japan with conventional bombs. But maybe that we were terrible for doing that too. I don't know. On the flip side, if we hadn't dropped the atomic weapons on Japan, we might have ended up having to do a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands, given how the Japanese fought to defend small islands that they weren't even part of Japan. Imagine how they would have fought to defend Japan, and there would have been further casualties. So the real truth of the matter is that World War One was a moral catastrophe from start to end. The Axis started it. They did terrible things, and we were put in the Allies were put in a position where we felt like we had to do some terrible things back to them to stop it. All right, that finishes it up for World War II, except I'm going to talk a little bit about the home front in America in one more video. See you later.